everybody has ideas.
You can pinpoint that might be able to, there's some truth to that, don't you? Augment it in some way. But wait, there's more. The drivers of human preference in the brain. Then I have ADD, and I swear to God, the things that you think about. Welcome to the Ideasicle Podcast. Today we have with us arguably the hottest creative director in the country today, David Lubars, the chairman and chief creative officer at BBDO North America. For those not in the ad biz, here's a rundown of David's storied career. He began his career in 1981. He has since won every major creative award in the world several times over. His work has been written about in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Business 2.0, and Time magazine, and has appeared on the cover of Archive magazine twice. He's been named Creative Director of the Year in the trade publication Adweek. His BMW films, which were one of my favorite things that he's done, was made part of the Museum of Modern Art's permanent collection in New York City, and won the first ever awarded Titanium Lion at Cannes. He's been the subject of feature stories in New York Magazine, Creativity, Archive, Fast Company, and American Executive. Before joining BBDO, David was president of Fallon Worldwide and executive creative director of Fallon North America, where he oversaw famous work for Citibank and BMW, among many others. He currently resides in New York City with his wife Cindy and two sons, Michael and Alex. Welcome, David Lubars.
Thank you, Will.
It is so cool to have you here, and we're going to do something a little different this time. You know, normally I would try to get some insights out of you as to your perspective of creativity, but when we were talking about this, David and I have known each other for 20 years, and what we quickly discovered when we first met was that we're both ridiculous Beatles fans. And through the years, we've had countless debates. Everybody who's a Beatle fan and passionate about it has debates about them. So we've had those debates, discussions, and arguments about all of that, and I thought it'd be interesting to bring you, our listeners, into one of those conversations today. Because to me, and I know you agree, David, the Beatles are the epitome of creativity and ideation. We can all learn from them. So let's get started. To me, David, there are two kinds of Beatles fans. They're the kinds who just like the songs, and the kind who deeply appreciate and study their craft, their creativity, and their ingenuity. I consider you and me to be in the latter camp, but what do you think it was about the Beatles' craft that is so inspiring?
Well, I mean, how do you sum that up in one little phrase? But the thing is, they were this combination of individuals that were the perfect exact fit. And I've thought about it. I go, there must be these other combinations around the world of people like that, but they've never met, and somehow, miraculously, these guys lived in the same town and actually met.
That's great.
And they, like each guy brought a thing to the party that the other guy, so in other words, like a great company or agency, you exploit each other's strengths and then cover each other's weaknesses, and it seems that it was just the perfect mix until it became not a good mix.
Yeah, that's true. It really did get heated towards the end, and power struggles and all that kind of stuff. It almost reminds me of an agency sometimes. It can, they ran into the deadlines that we run into. They had the politics that we ran into. Of course, they had the tragedy of their manager dying in 66 or 7, which certainly didn't help. Are there parallels there, do you think, to our business?
Well, I think they are, because when you put the work first, everybody has an ego, right? So we all have egos in the business, but when you focus it in a healthy, soulful way just towards the work, in other words, we're all here to serve the work, which in our business is to serve a client's, success. But then all goes right, and all the right things happen for you. The problem the Beatles is, which is a lot of agencies that are hot, there was too much talent to be contained in one band. So you have the Rolling Stones, who are fantastic, but that's because individually they needed each other too much. Like you listen to the Keith Richards solo album, it's great, but they could have better singing. And the Jagger albums just don't have that scratch to them. Whereas the Beatles on their own had a lot of success, so I think they started to just kind of, it was just too small for all that talent. And even Ringo Starr, who wasn't even a writer or singer, had big number one hits. How many bands can I mean, he was the fourth option, and he's having number one hits.
Yeah, no kidding. And
So
the
they
third
just-
option got better and better, too. I mean, he really exploded at the end there, which made it, to your point, almost impossible to contain.
Well, so if you go back to the agency comparison, it started out with those two guys, and the other guys were sort of support guys. So then it turns out the third guy is a great writer on his own, so now there's not enough room for him. Where in the beginning he was happy with his role. So that's what happens at agencies too. The dynamics change, people grow at different paces, new ideas come in, new things, and the great agency, the cement stays liquid. You never let it harden so that these people can grow and achieve their goals without having to feel they have to leave.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about the early Beatles, to me, they were much more of a band. They were more, even though Lennon and McCartney were clearly the songwriting team and all that, and they were doing most of the singing. They were such a solid band, and by the end, they were still technically a band because they were all playing together. But it seemed more like the only way that they could contain all that talent was to create albums like the White Album, which was essentially Paul and the Beatles, or then John and the Beatles, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, like they were sidemen to whoever's song it was.
Yeah, as opposed to a real team effort. I don't know if you ever read that book by Jeff Emmerich, Here, There, and Everywhere. It's a fantastic...
Yeah, I did.
Did you? He's great. He was an insider, obviously, in the last 4 or 5 years. He was one of the engineers at Abbey Road. And he talked a lot about how they wrote songs together and even how John Lennon, even though he hated the song Obla Di, Obla Da, he came in one night drunk off his ass, and Paul was down there trying to finish the song or whatever he was doing. And John comes down and says and plays that lick in the beginning of the song on the piano, and says, "There's your bloody opening to the terrible song," or whatever. And Paul was actually touched, I think, by that. But that animosity, to your point earlier, it was still all about the work, even when they were sort of hating each other's guts.
Yeah, well, so the reason that, but they were partners. So the thing about an agency is even if you're not partners, how do you keep people motivated and not hate each other's guts and feel when they come to work? It's funny, Will, all the good agencies take people, from each other, and that happens a lot. But recently I've noticed a disproportionate amount of people wanting to come to a BBDO from two particular agencies that are good and I respect. I'm like, why is that? So we kind of probed it, and what we're learning is they're saying, well, we like the work we do here, but we hear that you guys not only do this good work, but it's like a good vibe there. It's a cool place to go. And so that actually has value. So you can't have that kind of acrimony and animosity last too long. You have to have a place people like to actually spend a long period of time, as we found out with them because they broke up.
Yeah, and I think it's back to what you were saying, that if you have a single-minded vision and it's all about the work, it's much easier to distance yourself from your personal issues that you have. Forget about all that. This is about Abbey Road and making it great, or this is about the White Album making it great. As opposed to, I can set aside my issues with this guy for a minute because there's a higher purpose here.
Yeah. And it's funny because only McCartney wanted to keep them together, and he loved it. So I don't know. It's too bad.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like he's still trying to keep them together to this day. So here's where things get a little contentious, and I don't think we totally agree on this, judging from the 7,000 other conversations we've had about the Beatles over 20 years. John or Paul?
See, I'm not gonna play that game.
Oh, come on.
I'm not gonna play that game. I mean, if you force me to, I'll pick John. But again, the beauty of them was they each had things that the other guy didn't that made 1 + 1 being turn into 3.
Talk about that a little bit.
For example, Lennon was a very impatient. He just wanted to knock out the recordings, and on his solo albums, you can hear they feel very kind of dashed off. And McCartney, even his lamest songs have a glistening, fantastic feel to them. In fact, the criticism is too much attention to the production, not enough to the writing. So he was a studio rat. So that worked great for them because so the stories of him tooling around on Strawberry Fields or fixing stuff up on I'm the Walrus. and made it a better track. Or of course, one of their, maybe the masterpiece, A Day in the Life. Lennon had that part, and then McCartney surrounded it with all that orchestral stuff. And so even little things like that, they were just a perfect combination until they weren't.
Yeah, and it even seemed like on Abbey Road, McCartney started to establish his, love for taking a bunch of songs and then stripping them all together. He did it a couple of times in his solo albums.
Yeah.
No way nearly as well as he did on Abbey Road. But that was, to your point, he was a studio rat, and you can't do that unless you know what you're doing back there.
Exactly. So, and then you had, George bringing influences in. I mean, it was just one of these weird gumbos that just came together. And again, I always think, like, what other combinations could there have been, except they never met?
Yeah, it really is interesting to think about. And also, again, back to the Jeff Emmerich book, he talked about how they really labored over songs. They would do them over. I mean, in the beginning, they would do it in an afternoon, like the whole album. They'd only have a day for their session to bang the album out. They weren't the Beatles yet. They were, small B. And towards the end, they would spend weeks, if not months, on an individual song to get it exactly right.
But again, there's parallels to our business, because if you to us the great agencies, the work is never done until it's actually done. There's no sort of, okay, we got it finished. Like, you continually hone and craft and tailor. And if you listen to the stuff they had on the anthology discs, mm-hmm. every choice they made for the final one was always right. Like, there's nothing, like, I love listening to those discs, but there's nothing I think is better than what they put out. And that just comes from continually probing the thing and penetrating to make sure it's the most reductionist, minimalist, exact right, with no wasted anything. And that's what I think a great creative person does in any field.
Well, I think the other parallel is that they were the writers. They had the vision for the music, but the engineers were sort of, the directors and photographers that we use today. The creative process continues even after the concept is established. Isn't it sort of true?
Well, yeah, but also, but like us, they pick the right people, the right technicians, the right, whatever the parallels are to, a director or a sound mixer and all. They picked the right people, and they had a team. It's always a team. Nobody can do things in a vacuum.
Yeah.
As we see from some of the lesser solo stuff and the really great solo stuff, they were surrounded by great people, which all good creative has to be. I mean, I guess Picasso, there's a few examples here and there, but for the most part, when you're making a big mass creative platform, you really need a good team.
It's so true. So which album do you think was the most creative album? And then which one was your favorite, if it's not the same?
Yeah, because favorite isn't always it's hard to... I guess if you made me pick a favorite, I guess it would be Revolver, because I felt they were still on an up. There's a lot of creativity, and I like crunchy guitars. But most creative, geez, I don't know. I mean, there's so many definitions about what creativity is. I don't know. That's one I really don't know how to answer.
It's also a relative term, so you sort of can't talk about the most creative album without thinking about what the album was before it,
Yeah.
To see what was the delta between the two. I mean, Sgt. Pepper is the one that gets all the credit for creativity, but I'm with you. I think Revolver had some of the most experimental types of stuff with She Said, all those backward tape loops that they were doing. And I think didn't they do a homework assignment where everybody had to go home and record a loop and then bring it
the next day? Yeah, I guess so. Yeah,
I love that.
I mean, it's very creative. And by the way, a lot of that creativity was the result of primitive technology. So they had to come up with answers like holding pencils around tape loops and stuff that today you just all put into a desk and that you could manipulate. So
So Revolver is your choice?
If you made me.
Yeah. I'd have to say my favorite album, though, is Abbey Road. I think from a listenability standpoint, production standpoint, songwriting, to me, that's my favorite.
Well, there's a point about that one, too, that I think is relevant today to this industry, too. Some of their albums, you can tell, are from the 60s, or some of their songs, like that. Abbey Road, you literally could put out today, and it would sound as modern as anything. I mean, it has a timeless... And the best advertising and digital, whatever medium it's in, has that quality too. So if you look at a Volkswagen print ad from 1959, you could put that out today too.
Right, that's a great point. So what do you think happened to these guys after they broke up? Like, to your point earlier, there was too much talent to contain. So then once the container broke and they were all on their own, it seemed like each of the guys did everything they could possibly do to not sound like the Beatles. And, at least in the early days, and for some, for a lifetime, it sort of continued. What do you think of that? Why did that happen?
Well, first of all, I think it's admirable because you can't recreate something that's not really existing anymore. And the other thing is, who wants to live on their laurels? You want to try new things. In fact, the Beatles didn't sound like the Beatles during the Beatles. They kept on changing course. So I think that's just that's what creative people do. They try new things.
Did you have any favorite solo albums?
I did. I mean, the best one of all I thought was that John Lennon Plastic Ono Band album.
Yeah.
And then I also thought All Things Must Pass was great. I thought Ram was fantastic. So I think the stuff that they did solo that was of Beatles quality, and even on their crappiest albums, there's always one or two things that that was kind of quality. That would have fit. But it's hard to be 1/4 of something that was so, you're not going to live up to that. So I think it's healthy to go other ways.
Yeah, I felt that McCartney always maintained his melodic prowess throughout his entire solo career, but the production values got very, very wet at times and a little cheesy at times too, and John was able to maintain an edge, though I didn't think his songwriting was quite as melodic as McCartney's.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. I thought that first album, or that first post Beatle album was great. I thought Walls and Bridges was great. I thought that was very melodic. It's hard to kind of put these guys in these boxes. It's great. Yeah,
it is true. Do you happen to know Mark Ray, by any chance, creative director at North in Portland, Oregon?
I don't.
He's a buddy of mine, and we were talking about how I was going to talk to you about the Beatles, and he said, just the other day, I was talking to a CEO of a client and brought up the Beatles as an example of how you grow love and trust among fans by being honest, excellent, and consistent at what they've come to expect from you. I thought that was a pretty good analogy. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it is. And, think about what they did. It was pure creativity, unadulterated, not compromised, and yet so massively popular. That's really hard to do. And I think they did it the way Mark laid out for you.
Yeah, and so talk about the dynamic of a client in the creative process, because you could argue that in the early days the Beatles' client was their manager, Brian Epstein, or George Martin, who they were trying to please. These were young kids, but towards the end they had nobody to please but each other, really.
Well, I don't know if I agree with that. George Martin wanted them to do these crappy Tin Pan Alley songs, which they refused to do. I think they always would. I think they were always trying to please the work. And again, that's what we try to do. We're all in service to the work, and everything else is artifice. And so our work is there to serve that client's success. And our relationships here are not about me selling stuff to them, and I hope you'll want to do it and trust me. It's like we're together, and we walk down this road of logic and common sense, and there's no selling really. It's like it's identifying the problem, and here are logical, smart ways to solve it. And if you believe that creativity is an economic multiplier when done responsibly and well, and can give disproportionate value back, there's no selling. There's no client really. It's the team, including the client, taking something to market.
Yeah, it's so true. I remember the show we went to in New York when we saw McCartney that night. What was the name of that place?
I forget. It was a little club.
Ballroom, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, talk about a guy selling his work. He was, this is only, 3-4 years ago, and it was a 700-people club. McCartney gets up there, and, I was supposed to be upstairs with you, but I was downstairs literally 8 feet away from him, and there was no way I was leaving that spot. And he was incredible. He was like, in 1963, having the time of his life selling the work that he created. It was just an inspiration.
Yeah, he was very good. He was very good that night.
I remember you're also a Dylan fan. I remember seeing him on 60 Minutes, and they were asking him about the 60s, about that experience, and when he was so prolific. And he said something like, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't know, I was in a zone. I can't do that anymore. And, it just stopped. And it was a vibe, call it a love vibe, call it whatever, but I was in it, and I could do it then, and I can't do it now. Something like that. Do you think there's anything to that from a creative standpoint?
Well, yes and no. Yes and no, because, first of all, he's writing brilliant songs now these last 10 years. This is one of his golden, when it's all said and done, this will be one of his golden periods. But I think what he meant was it was just pouring out of him. And I think now he has to sit down and work at it. But that doesn't mean he still can't do it. And it's true that your brain changes. I mean, all those great scientists like Einstein, all their best stuff happened when they were 22. And they were brilliant after, but it was no more E equals MC squared after. So I think, when you're that young and just full of stuff, it's all pouring out of you. But that doesn't mean it ever has to atrophy, because his last album had great songs on it. It's just probably harder for him to do.
Yeah, and he certainly sounds different.
Meanwhile, he's like frickin' 70, too, by the way.
I know, so we should give him a little break.
Yeah.
It was like McCartney said in one of his albums. He said, I go back so far I'm in front of me.
Yeah.
I think there's some truth to that. Well, David, I really appreciate you being on the show today. This is really interesting to hear the linkage of creativity to our insane business that is, arguably as creative as music is. Thanks very much for being here.
It's my great pleasure, Will.
And that's all the time we have for today. Tune in next time for another edition of the Ideasicle Podcast. And in the meantime, I invite you to my blog at www.ideasicle.com/blog, where we can continue this conversation, where I post David's podcast. And you can also get it on iTunes. If you subscribe to the Ideasicle Podcast on iTunes, you'll never miss another episode. So till next time.